Hello everybody and welcome to the video. In this video we're going to be going over how to make a Mario-like 2D platformer game. We're going to set up the controller for the player. We're going to have the ability to move left and right and also jump up and down. We're going to also cover the animations. So as you can see here, we have an idle animation, we have a running animation, and we have a jumping animation. We're also going to make it so the platforms here are smooth when we jump into them, and so we don't get stuck on them or anything like that. And so that's what we're going to cover in this episode. So with that, we'll go ahead and we'll get started. So the first thing that we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and set up the scene. I found this asset here on the asset store that I think looks pretty good. It's a free asset. You can go ahead and use it if you'd like, but I'm going to go ahead and go to the asset store and click on Open in Unity and then Open Unity Editor. That's going to take us here to the asset, and we can go ahead and you'll click on download if you haven't downloaded it before, and then you can go ahead and import it, and then you can go ahead and import everything here. All right, once we have that imported here, I'll go ahead and I'm going to start with setting up the background. So I'll come over here and then I will do a create empty, and I'm simply going to call this one background. And then on this, we're going to add a component here of a sprite renderer. Once we have the sprite renderer here added, what we can do is we can go into our asset and we can find the background that we want. So there's quite a few of them in here. I think I'm just going to stick with the first one here. Go ahead, select that and drag it into the sprite field. And you can go ahead and do that with any of the backgrounds of your choosing. Next up, we're going to want to set up the environment. So we're going to want to set up the ground and a couple of platforms here that we can test out our jumping on. So I'm going to start by right clicking and doing a create empty. I'm going to call this one environment. And then I'm going to put all of the items for the environment underneath this. And here under the assets, they have the tiles. So we have 2.5D tiles that we can go ahead and use. And they have different ones that look differently here for the different seasons. I think we're just going to stick with the autumn one here. Now, the first thing that I want to do is I'm going to set up the ground. So for that, I'm going to use one of the larger ones, and I'm simply going to click and drag that into our scene. And for this initial scene here, all I'm going to do is simply scale this up on the X here. Next up, we're going to want to add in a couple of the platforms as well. So go ahead and zoom in a little bit here, and then I'll go up to one of the smaller ones, drag that into the game, for example, and then go ahead and scale this how we think. Maybe make it a little longer. I'm probably going to make mine a little bit shorter there, like so. And then I'll just do a Control D 2 times here, and then probably move these a little bit just so they're off to the sides. Maybe something like that. That way we can test out our jumping here. And then the next thing, I'm also going to go ahead and grab all of these and move them under the environment. So this first one here is going to be our ground. And then these other 3 are going to be our floating ground. So I'm going to go ahead and rename these to floating ground 1, 2, and 3. And that's just to keep track of everything and make it nice and orderly for us here. And one thing we will need to add on all 3 of these is going to be a box collider. So I'm going to select all of them, click on add component, and go ahead and get that added, the box collider 2D here, so we don't forget. The next thing that we're going to want to do is add in our player. So we're going to go here underneath our asset. We're going to find our characters, and we have a few of them here, a couple different ones that we can do. You can go to anyone, but I'm just going to go in here to idle. And then over here, we have the sprites that are set up for the idle animation. So if we hover, drag these over here, you can see that, we have these ones, which are kind of smaller. And then we have these ones, which are a little bit larger. Feel free to use whichever one you would like, obviously. I'm going to use the smaller ones because I have plans for the larger ones later on in the game. But for now, we'll go ahead and delete those. I just wanted to show you kind of the size difference there. So what we'll do is we'll go ahead and we'll click on the one that we want to use. Like I said, I'm using the 1X for now. And then I'm going to go ahead and just duplicate that so we don't ruin anything. And then what we want to do to get an individual sprite out of here is over here on the right hand side, we can click on the sprite mode We can change that from single to multiple, and then we can go ahead and open up our sprite editor. With this pop-up, we'll go ahead and we're going to click apply. That's going to open up our sprite sheet here. And what we can do is we can come up here in the top and click on slice. You can leave all of this how it is and click slice. That's going to automatically cut out each one of these sprites. And then over here, you can click on apply, and then we can close out of this screen. And now back here in our editor, if we expand this one by one, the one that we duplicated here, we have a whole bunch of different sprites. And if we click, you can see over here, each one of these is a little bit different. But we'll just go ahead and take the very first one here where they're standing straight, and we can drag that into our game. And now that's going to be our player. So we can go ahead, we can come over here, we can rename this to player. And then we'll go ahead and before we forget, we'll add a couple of components here. We're going to need a collider for the player. So we'll go ahead and we'll use a box collider for this. So we'll add the box collider 2D, and we're also going to need a rigid body. So we'll go ahead and add the rigid body 2D as well. And then one last thing that we'll do here with the player is we're going to go and create a new folder, call this one prefabs. And then we'll want to go ahead and click and drag the player under here. So the player is now a prefab. The next thing that we're going to need to add is the input actions. So we'll go ahead and we'll go to Windows and then Package Manager. And we'll change this to the Unity registry. And if you're not already here, you can type in input over here, and that'll pull it up. And then you go ahead and install that. Once that's done installing, you're going to get this little warning. We can go ahead and click yes. So that way we can turn this on. Once our editor loads back up here, we'll go ahead, we'll click on the player, and we're going to add a component, and this component is going to be the player input. Now for the player input, we're going to need to create some actions. So we'll go ahead and click on create actions, and then you can name yours whatever you would like. I'm going to call mine player, and then that's going to open up this screen here. And by default, you'll see that we already have a couple of them. So we have move already set up, and that's going to be set up with for the gamepad, for the WASD, and for the arrows here. So that's going to be set up for us already. We have also look and fire, but we're not going to be using those right at the moment. One input that we're going to want to add for an action here is going to be for jumping. So we'll go ahead, we'll click the little plus symbol here. We'll call this one jump. And we can leave this at button. And then for the binding, we can click on this and drop down the little path here. And if yours is like mine, the listen button is hidden here. It's a bug, but this is the listen button. You can go ahead and you can click this, and then you can type in your button. So I'm going to press space, and it's going to bring up our space keyboard. And that's the one that we're going to want to use for jumping. If you want to add like a controller support, for example, you can also come in here and you can click on gamepad, and then button south is going to be the normal one for that kind of stuff. You could do that as well. And if you want to have both of them in here, you can just click here to add a new binding, and then you can have a binding for both of those. So now we have the button south, and our keyboard space button will do the same thing. They'll both trigger our jump that we create. Then we can go ahead and you can click on save your asset, and we'll close this up. Now that we have the player input set up, one thing that you'll notice is that this little icon is here, and it's kind of annoying, at least I believe. If you want to remove this, you can simply come up here and click this, and it's going to remove all of the gizmos. If you don't want to remove all of them, you can click the little drop down and select over here which one you want to remove. For some reason, you can't remove this. However, you can minimize the 3D icons here, which is what I'm going to do. That way they are no longer here. And one last thing that we're going to want to do before we get into the coding here is we're going to want to right click on our player, and we're going to create an empty underneath of it. And this is going to be called the ground check. And we'll use this for our jumping. And then we're going to want to make sure that this is moved right underneath of the player here. So just a little bit under, not too far. And then if you did what I did and you didn't actually go into the prefab, you can come over here, and with the player selected, you click on overrides and apply all, and that's going to apply those changes to the prefab as well. With that done, we'll go ahead, we'll go into our assets folder here, and we're going to create a new folder. We're going to call this one scripts. And then inside this folder, we're going to create a new script, and we'll call this one player movement. Once the script is open here, we can go ahead and we can remove these items at the top. Underneath using Unity Engine, we're going to want to add another using, and this one we're going to do Unity Engine again, except for this time it's going to be .input system. I'm also going to go ahead and remove these comments here. And then real quick before we start with the code, one last thing that I forgot about is adding the ground layer. So if you click on one of your objects over here, we can click on layer and add a new one. And then I'm simply going to call this one ground. And then now we're going to want to go ahead and select our items that are considered the ground here, and we'll change that layer to ground. Now we'll go ahead and we'll get started here, and we're going to want to add a couple of serialized fields. So the first one is going to be for our rigid body. So rigid body 2D, I'm going to call that RB, and that's going to get a reference to the player's rigid body 2D component. Next up, we're going to do another serialized field. This one is going to be of a type transform, and this one is going to be for the ground check. This is going to get a reference to that ground check that we created there underneath the player. And then the last one that we'll do is we'll do another serialized field. This one is going to be of type layer mask, and this one we're going to call the ground layer. And this is going to get a reference to that ground layer that we just created there to determine what is considered the ground. Next up, we're going to need a couple of floats. The first one I'm just going to call horizontal. So this is going to get the horizontal movement value or input value for the player. Next up is going to be the speed. So this is going to be how fast our player is going to move. And I'm going to set that to the 7F for now. Next up is going to be our jumping power. So another float. And for this one, I'm going to set it to 8F for now. Next, we have a bool, and this one is going to be called is facing right. We'll use this one to determine which way our player is facing, and that's going to apply the specific animations and stuff later on, and also which direction the player should be facing while moving. And we'll set that one to true by default. We're also going to need another bool here to determine if the player is grounded or not. So I'm simply going to call this one grounded. So the first thing that we're going to want to do is we're going to want to make the player move. For that, we can make a public method. And this one I'm going to call move player. And this one is going to take an input action. And it's going to be input action.callback context. And we can type in context, or we can pass in context. And now what we're going to do is this is how we're going to get the horizontal value. So the horizontal is going to equal our context.read value. And we're going to read the value of a vector2. Put our parentheses, and then this is going to be the x value. And then after that, we're going to create another method, and this is going to be how we set the player's velocity. So we'll call it set player velocity. But then in here, this is where we're going to set the velocity of the rigid body. So rb.velocity, and that's going to be equal to a new vector2. And in here, we're going to do the horizontal value that we just got, and we're going to multiply that by our speed. And then for the x, and then for the y, we're going to do the rb.velocity.y, as that should not be changing. And then in the update method here, what we're going to want to do is we're going to want to call set player velocity. We'll go ahead and save this, and then jump back into the editor. Now we're going to want to go into our scripts here. We'll add that script to our player. So then now we're going to need to add in a couple of things. We're going to need the rigid body for our players, so we can drag in our player here to get that. For our ground check, we can drag this in here as well. And I realized I spelled this wrong, so I'll fix this when we go back into the script. And then for our ground layer, we'll select this, drop down here, and select that ground layer that we created earlier. And then what we'll also want to do is on our player input here, we're going to want to change the behavior to invoke Unity events. And then we'll click this little events arrow and click on player. So then these are going to be the events that we set up in our input actions. So for the move, what we want to do is we'll click the plus to add that here. And then we'll go ahead and we'll drag in the player. We'll click on the no function here, go down to player movement, and then click on move player. Now we should be able to test this out, and we should be able to move left and right. So when we're pressing left, pressing right, that is working. Pressing up and down doesn't do anything because we don't have anything for the vertical value, only the horizontal, but we are moving now. Now that we have our player moving, the next thing that we're going to want to do here is make the player jump. And before we make the player jump here, we're going to want to figure out if the player is grounded or not. So we're going to set up a bool, and we're going to call this one is grounded. And this is going to be like this. Now in here, we're going to actually return physics 2D. And then this is going to be dot overlap circle. And in here, we're going to do the ground check dot position, comma, and then a value, and I'm going to use 0.05f, and then we're also going to do the ground layer. So now what we're doing with this is we're going to be checking if the player is grounded by performing a circle overlap check at the ground check position, and we're going to be with a small radius defined by the ground layer mask that we set here. And then for this, we're going to want to do it in fixed update since it is a physics calculation. And this is where we'll set that grounded that we set up earlier. And that's going to be equal to is grounded. And then next we'll need to set up our method for jumping. So this is going to be a public method. And we're simply going to call it jump. And similar to the move player, this is going to take in an input action and the dot callback context of type context. So now in here, we're going to write some if statements. And the first one, we're going to say if the context is performed. So if the action is performed and if we are grounded, so and grounded, then we're going to want to make the player move up. So we're going to take the rigid body and move the velocity. So rb.velocity, and that's going to be equal to a new vector 2. And then in here, we're going to input the rb.velocity for the x, as we want to leave that the same. And then for the y, we're actually going to be using the jumping power. So now that should move our player forward or player up. And then we're also going to want to do an else if statement here. And we want to say in this one, we're going to say if the context is canceled. So if the player attempts to perform this and does it like halfway, for example, they let go of the button, then we're going to again want to move the player upwards. However, we're going to do it in we're going to do it with a smaller amount of force. So for that, we're going to set the rb.velocity, set that equal to a new vector 2 again. And in here, this time we're going to do the rb.velocity dot x for the x. And then for the y, we're going to do the rb.velocity dot y, except for this time we're going to multiply this by half, for example, so 0.5f. So now, similar to how we set up move, we're going to want to come into the player and then go into the player input here and go to the events and the player events. We'll want to find our jump, click on the little plus symbol there. We'll drag in the player down to the objects and then select our player movement function and select jump from the list. Now with that, we should be able to test this out and the player should be able to jump now. So we can still move left and right, and pressing space, the player moves up. You'll see if I press and hold it, he jumps pretty high, but if I just press it, he stops about halfway or so. The next thing that we're going to need to do here is we're going to need to set up our animation. To do that, we're going to want to pull in a couple of windows. So we're going to go up here to window, animation, and we're going to want the animation window. And I'm going to dock mine down here if you don't already have yours. And then we're also going to need the animator window as well. And I'm going to put mine up here where it goes. With that, we're ready to start doing our animation. So we'll select our player here. And in the animation window, we're going to go down here and click on create. Here we'll want to name our animation. The first one that we're going to do is going to be idle. So I'm going to call it idle and click on save. Now you can see that we have idle down here. Now for this, we already had some animations set up for us in the package that we downloaded. So over here, we're going to come over here and look at the idle. So what we're going to want to do with this is we're going to click on the one that we want, which for the one that I'm using is going to be this 1x1. I'm going to change the sprite mode to multiple, click on sprite editor, click apply. And then in here, we're going to slice this. So we're going to go to slice, click on slice. It's going to automatically pull those out. We can click apply and close this screen. And now if we take a look, we'll see that we have a whole list of these. So this is the animation for each spot. You can see that it's different there each time. And what we can do is we can simply select all of these and drag these over to here. And now if we go ahead and we click on play, you can see that this is animating our player. If you wanted to, you can drag this out a little bit to make it a little bit slower. So he's not moving so fast, for example. He's just slowly idling there. So I think that I'll put mine to maybe 25 or so, roughly, something like this. I think that looks good. Now we're going to want to do something similar for jumping and running. So down here in the animation tab with our player selected, we can click this little drop down, create a new clip. This one we can call run or running maybe. And then I'm going to go over here in our assets, find the one for 1x here. And again, change this to multiple, click the sprite editor and apply. And then you can see all the different frames here. So we're going to go ahead and slice these and click apply. Close this window. And now we will have all of these. So I'll select them all and drag them in here. And now we can click on play and we can see that our player is running. And again, if we wanted to make him run a little slower, a little faster, however you want to do that, you can set that up however you think looks best. I think right there looks pretty good. And then one last thing, we're going to want to add one more here. And this one is going to be for our jump. So I'm going to call it jumping. And again, I'm going to go into jump. I'm going to select this, go into multiple, sprite editor, apply. There's only the two here. We're going to slice them, apply them, close the screen. And then now I'm going to click and drag these in here. Now, if we click on play, that's obviously way too fast. I think something like this is going to work. We'll have to wait and maybe adjust this one a little bit later once we actually start jumping with the player. And one thing that you'll notice here is that we have our animator was created and added here. We'll go ahead and we can check that on. And this was set up automatically for us. Now we're going to want to go up here to the animator and we'll see that we have all of these here. So on entry, we're going to go right into an idle form. So if we click on play, we should see that our player is idling right away. And you can see here, maybe if I zoom in a little bit, the player is actually idling there. So now we need to connect all of these up. So from an idle, we should be able to go from idle to running or idle to jumping, and from running to jumping as well. So what we'll do is we can click here, we can right click and do make transition, and we'll do this as well to make them go back and forth. We'll do the same thing with jumping and idle. And then, like I said, we also want to go from running to jumping. However, we do not want to go from jumping to running. We're just going to go from jumping, idle, and then back into running. And so we're also going to want to set up a couple of parameters. So these we're going to add as bools. The first one we're going to want is jumping. And we're also going to want an is running. Next, we're going to want to set up or change some of these transitions here. So you can see over here, we have some settings. We're going to want to change off the has exit time for these. We don't want any of ours to have the has exit time set on. And then we'll want to add a couple of conditions here. So for this one, to go from idle to running, we're going to want to make sure that is running is true. And then to go back from running to idle, we're going to want to have is running set to false. And then from running to jumping, condition is going to have to be is jumping is true. The same with idle. From idle to jumping, we're going to want is jumping set to true. And then going back, we're going to want to make sure that is jumping is set to false. So that should be everything in the editor here. And now we'll go ahead and we'll get back to working on our code. All right, so back in the code, the first thing that we're going to need to do here is we're going to need to get a reference to the player's animator. So for that, that's going to be of type animator. And I'm simply going to call that one animator. Then in our start method here, we're going to get the animator component that is attached to the player. So animator is going to equal our get component of type animator. So next we're going to scroll down here and towards the bottom of our code, we're going to add in a method here that's going to flip the player's facing the direction that the player is facing by reversing the local scale on the x-axis. So that method is we're going to do void and we're going to call it flip. And now in here, we're going to say is facing right, and that's going to equal is not facing right. Next, we're going to do the local scale. So a vector3, and we'll call it local scale. And that is going to equal our transform.local scale. And we're going to adjust the local scale.x. So local scale.x, and that is going to be multiply equals -1f, and then we're going to set our transform.local scale, and that's going to equal the new local scale. So this is what we will call when we want to flip the player. And underneath here, we're going to create another method that's going to decide when we should be calling this method. So this one's going to be a void, and we're going to call it flip player if needed. Now in here, we're going to have an if statement. And this is going to flip the player sprite if it's necessary based on the horizontal input. So what we'll do is we're going to say if the player is not facing right, so exclamation point is facing right, and the horizontal is greater than 0f. So that means they're facing left and they are moving right. Then what we're going to want to do is we'll call flip, and then we'll also do an else if. So down here, else if they are facing right and the horizontal is less than 0. So they're facing right and then now they're going left. We'll also want to flip. And then now we're going to need to call this in update. And then now we're going to want to create a method here to update the running animation. So I'm going to do that right here underneath the flipping the player if needed. This one is going to again be void, and I'm going to call it update running animation. So then first here, we're going to have a bool, and this is going to be called is running. And this is going to determine if the player is running based on the horizontal input and whether or not they are grounded. So this is going to be mathf dot abs, and we're going to put in the horizontal here, and we're going to say greater than 0.1f and grounded. So then now we're going to update the animator set bool, the animator bool. So we're going to say animator dot set bool, and we're going to set the bool of is running. And here you'll have to make sure that you type this correctly, whatever you typed as your bool when you're setting up the animator, and then comma our is running that we just created there. And then we're going to want to say down here, if the horizontal input is 0, then we're going to want to stop the running animation. So another if method, so if, and here again, we're going to use the mathf dot abs, and one more time we are going to input the horizontal, and we're simply going to then say less than the 0.1f, and then here we're going to set the animator, the bool, to false. So animator dot set bool, and the bool that we want to set is again is running, and we want that one to be false. And now we're going to want to call this in update as well. And then the last thing is down here in our jump method, we can set up the animator in here as well. So in the first if statement that we have here underneath where we set our velocity, what we can do is we can do animator.setBool again. And the bool that we're going to want to set this time is going to be isJumping. And we want that to set to true. And then we're also going to want to set the running one to false. So again, animator.setBool. And here we're going to do isRunning. And we're going to set this one to false. And then down here, if we get canceled, we're also going to want to set the jump bool isJumping bool to false. So animator.setBool. And again, this one is the isJumping. And we're setting that one to false. And then one last thing that we want to do under this first else if statement, we're going to want to add in another else if statement. And this time we're going to simply say if we are grounded, then we want to ensure that the isJumping bool is set to false. So we're going to do the animator.setBool again for isJumping and set that one to false. And one last thing was the ground check. I needed to fix this, so I spelled this incorrectly last time. And you can do Control R on here and go ahead and we can fix this, and it's going to change it everywhere that we have it, as you can see down there. So we can go ahead and update that as well. And then back in the editor here, we just need to reassign that ground check since we changed it. Now if we go ahead and test, we see that we are idling. Our animations for running is working. It's a little bit of a delay when we start there, but we can definitely fix that. And then our jumping is not working. Okay, so a couple of things that we'll want to fix here. I'm not sure why, but for some reason under the player import or player input here, our jump function is no longer here. But I'll go ahead, we'll select this. We will select player movement and then select jump. So that should take care of us actually jumping. Back in the code here, also in our jump method here, where we're canceling this, we're also going to want to add in something else. So we're also going to want to say if the jump is canceled and the animator dot get bool, in here we want to say isJumping. Then we'll want to set it to false and do this since we're using the animation now. So let's test that out real quick, and then we can work on fixing the delay there for the running. Okay, so now we're jumping, which is better. However, it doesn't go into it doesn't fall down how it's supposed to in the animation. It just kind of spams the animation. So we'll fix that, and we'll fix the delay here with our running animation turning on. So to fix the jumping animation and make it play correctly, all we'll need to do is we'll need to go into our jumping animation here and take off the loop time. And I also noticed that for some reason I have all of these in my scripts folder. So I'm going to go ahead and create a new folder. I'm going to call this one animations. And then I'm going to move these over there. So again, all we did was took off the loop time for jumping. And now if we play that, we can see that when we jump, the animation is working properly. He goes up, down, and moves his arms how he should. And then now to fix the delay for going from idle to running, we don't want there to be any delay. We want it to go instantly. So we'll come in here to our animator window that we have, and we will click on the transition from idle to running. And what we're going to want to do is we're going to want to take this transition duration and set that down to 0. That will make it go, that will make it go instant. So we'll go ahead and I'm going to actually change this to play maximized here. We'll go ahead and we'll play that and test that out and confirm. So now, as soon as I press the button, there's no delay and it instantly goes. So one other thing that we might have noticed here is the player can kind of go crazy. We'll need to fix that. So to do that, we can go into the rigid body of the player, expand the constraints section, and then freeze the rotation on the Z-axis. So that way it doesn't rotate anymore like that. So now we're not rotating. However, we are now getting stuck on the sides of the platforms, which is obviously not something that we want. So to fix that, what we'll do is we'll go into assets here. I'm gonna create a new folder. I'm gonna call this one materials. And inside this folder here, what we're gonna do is we're gonna go to create and 2D, and then we're gonna create a physics material 2D. And I'm gonna call this one ground friction. And currently this is set to 0.4. I'm going to go ahead and set it to 0. And so then what we're going to do is we'll select all of our ground items here. Everything that is the ground, will expand the box collider. And right here in the material section, we can actually drag this in here, and that's going to apply that friction setting to these items. So now we'll go ahead and press play. And now we should expect to not get caught on here. So we glide over it nice and easily. We're not getting stuck, anything like that. We might be jumping a little bit too high for the actual game. Maybe we'll adjust that a little later. We can always change the settings if we would like, but that's going to be everything for this video. We set up the background, added some items here to the scene. We added the player controller so the player can move left and right or jump up and down. We also added the animations for the idle running and jumping there. In the next video, we'll go ahead and we'll continue on with the game and continue adding more features. So stay tuned and look out for the next video. Thank you for watching.